Hi guys, welcome to Peopleizer, the place to empower people. Today we'll be talking about traveling during restriction. It's a big topic as many people would like to travel during restriction, and there's still restriction in place actually, although you think that sometimes the mainstream media will tell you there's no more restriction. If you go into details, there's still some restriction in place. Today, Andrew is joining us. Andrew is an entrepreneur and is contributing to Peopleizer. He has an extended experience into traveling during restriction, and we want to leverage this experience. We want to, we think it will benefit you to listen to Andrew and his recommendation. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Good to have you. Andrew, let's start with the fear feeling. And what can we say about it, right?
I think that over the past 2 years, oftentimes it was possible to travel, even with minimal or no restrictions. But I've noticed that oftentimes people thought that it's not possible or they didn't want to, and it was because of fear, either because of fear directly, specifically of something, or just because of the feeling of uncertainty. So like they heard somewhere on the news, maybe some broadcaster who didn't really know the situation well, he said, oh, it's not possible. And they said, oh, fine, it's not possible. But that was oftentimes not the case.
Yeah, and we could feel like fear was in the air, right? It was this general feeling that impacted the mindset of the people. Now there was also this topic of misinformation, right? The difficulty to access.
I think it's closely related, actually, because you know, if, for example, what I mentioned about the uncertainty and thinking that something is not possible, it was that people didn't inform themselves, and it was not even that it was misinformation deliberately put out by somebody saying, oh, it's not possible. They just didn't check, you know, like, I mean, if some guy tells you it's not possible, do you just say, oh, fine, it's not possible? Or do you check, oh, is that really the case? Is there an exception for my case? And most people didn't do that. They just assumed that it goes whatever that person said, even though that may not have been fully true.
Yeah, so am I allowed to travel was one of the key questions, right?
Yes, in a lot of the cases it was yes. In general, people have the right to do that. They don't, but of course, there were some regional limitations oftentimes. But there were often exceptions. There were ways to get around it, or it was just simply completely open, even though the media may have been saying something different.
And it's because you travel extensively that for you, from your perspective, yeah, you tried it and you mainly saw this as being open and not being closed as.
You know, sometimes it was more like an advice, like it was an advice saying that people should not travel. And then, you know, at the beginning, when everything was uncertain, people were thinking, it made sense to think like, okay, maybe, you know, I should put it down. But then when you see that a lot of other things are not being followed, it didn't really make sense anymore at some point. So
let's as a citizen, right? So let's imagine I want to travel. Where should I find information? Where do you advise me to look for information so that I know if I can travel or not?
Well, if you already know your destination for a specific country, the best way to find the information is you check the government website. What are the rules for that, for entering to that specific destination?
So the government website of the target countries, right?
Yes.
The country where you're going.
Because I mean, this is the official information. This is the law. These are the regulations. So there can be no ambiguity in that regard. But if I just want to go somewhere and maybe I'm not sure, or I have a few options in mind, there are some comparison websites. Oftentimes, a lot of airlines run these websites, or kind of airline comparison websites like Skyscanner also have these tools where you can look and you select where you travel from and where you're going to, and that can give you an idea what the restrictions are for you in that specific situation. And that doesn't always have, most of the time in my experience, it was very good. It was up to date, it was accurate.
Yeah.
But sometimes there were some details missing. So it might sometimes look like it's not possible. But then maybe you go on the website, you study it in a little bit more detail, and you find out, oh, actually, in my case, I don't need that. It's fine.
So it does require a little bit of reading, right?
It does, yeah.
And another alternative could be to also talk to people who've been going to this place, right? Because sometimes in your network, you've got a friend or family member, or I don't know.
Yes, that can help.
Yeah.
That can help also because sometimes it's ambiguous, especially when you had to quarantine. Then sometimes it's not clear. Is that a recommendation? Is that a requirement? What happens if I break it? You know, then it's good to talk to people who have experience with it. But it goes both ways. If you just rely on people who have experience, it might be that they didn't have do the stuff properly, and they just got lucky that they were not checked enough. So
Yeah.
I would not rely on someone saying that I don't need that. You should check it before you travel.
More as a confirmation, but you're right. Yes. It can go both ways. Okay. What about exemptions?
Well, this is an interesting topic because oftentimes people just look at the kind of main list of things. Oh, I need this, I need that. It's not possible. It is possible, and they don't consider the idea of exemptions. But for most of the destinations over the past 2 years, they allowed some level of exemptions for some of the rules for some groups of people, and that really varied a lot. But it could be, for example, that in certain circumstances, certain kinds of people didn't need a test, or they didn't need to quarantine, or you don't need that document, you can use some other document. So all these kind of things can be useful. And even sometimes that you can do a different type of test that can be done online, that can be a great help.
Okay. The topic of bypassing quarantine, what is it about?
Well, sometimes people thought like, I can go to that destination, it's all fine. But then I'll have to quarantine for 5 days, 2 weeks, or something like that. Yeah. And it's a short trip or it's a business trip, so it doesn't really work. But then when you look at the government website, it said that for certain type of business trips, for example, it actually does not apply. So you could go and it would be fine.
Okay.
It's just one example. There might be other ways you can bypass the quarantine. So this bypass maybe is not the best word in that case, because here it's an actual official regulation saying that you don't need to for that specific case. But there might be also ways that, you know, like they say, oh, there's a quarantine, but then when you check the fine print, you find out that it's actually more like a recommendation, because, for example, in one country I saw they said that you really have to quarantine, but then they said, but when you do go outside, you need to wear a mask. So they're basically saying you can go wherever you want, you just have to wear a mask. That was the quarantine in that country. Okay. But you know, if you don't read the fine print, you might
don't
not
know.
Exactly. So
let's continue on those practices. The restrictions are often based on where you come from, right?
Yeah. This is where those comparison tools are very useful, because it can be that you're completely denied entry, regardless of what documents you have or not, if you're going from A to B. But then you find out from some other countries you can go there to your destination. So what you can do is you can make a stopover somewhere else. You may, of course, if you're flying, you may have to get out of the airport and stuff like that. But in some cases that might be enough. In other cases, you might have to spend certain amount of time at the transfer country, might be days or a couple of weeks. But if you have time and you're flexible, that can be a way to get to destinations where it's otherwise not possible to travel.
So what we're saying is basically the restriction from the viewpoint of the country of origin is important, right?
Yeah, I think for most of the pandemic, for example, it was not possible to go from Europe to the US, just as an example, if you don't have a US passport. But if you could go from Mexico to US without a problem. So that was a way. I think you had to spend some amount of time there because what they were asking about was where you've been the last 2 weeks. So that was a way for people to get to the US, for example, by spending 2 weeks in Mexico.
Good to know. Now, if you going from home or from the office or from anywhere to the airport, right, to go take your plane, right? So if there's local lockdowns, how do you deal with this?
So this was another way that people thought they could not travel, for example, because the travel by plane, for example, or to the destination was all fine, but there was a local lockdown. They were in one part of the country and the airport was in another part of the country, and it was not permitted to travel between the regions.
Yeah.
But of course, there were always some exceptions to that. Usually it depended, of course, from country to country, but it was usually about having a good reason. So in most circumstances, if you say, oh, I'm going there because I'm going to the airport, that would be fine. Sometimes they might ask you, why are you going to the airport? Then you're saying, oh, I'm leaving the country, of course. Then in most cases, that would be fine. This was, by the way, also touches on another topic that I saw in some cases. People were living in one country,
yeah,
and they were not originally from that country. They were just living there, like kind of expatriate. And of course, they wanted to visit their home country at some point, and they had the idea that it was not possible because the government said people are not allowed to leave the country, but they did not realize that it was actually possible.
Yeah.
Because if you're from another country and you're living, if you have passport from country A and you're living in country B, you can always leave that country. They can't really tell you not to. So you can just say, oh, I'm leaving the country. And then some of those people understood that, but then say, oh, but then I would not be able to get back. But that was also in most circumstances not true, because then you show, oh, I have residency in that country, I'm going back. So you could just travel back and forth continuously by playing those two cards.
Okay, good to know. The benefit of the flag system. Do you want to talk a bit about this?
So this is actually touches on the flag system. So flag system is what we call, in people who talk a lot about internalization, reducing your taxes, having international lifestyle, to have the system of flags where you have citizenship from one country, you have residency in another country. Maybe that's a place where you live, or you have maybe another residency somewhere else, just the residency, not actual residence. And then if you're an entrepreneur, you might have banking in another country, company registered in another country. That may be too complicated for most people and not worth it for most, but this is the kind of idea. If people can decide how many flags they want to use. So here in this context, having the first two flags, citizenship in A and residency in B, that helps really a lot, because most of the time people were, it was that, I think all the cases actually, when people were not allowed to leave the country, it applied to the citizens of the country, not to residents who had citizenship from somewhere else.
Okay.
And then also entering the country, most like 99% of the time around the world, what I saw when it was restricted that you could not enter the country for foreigners, the people who could enter the country were people who had citizenship and people who had residency. So if already, if you have that spread out, if you have these two flags, you could actually travel quite a bit just based on that.
That is very useful. Okay. That's a lot of advice. Let's imagine now that a use case is often that you arrive at the custom or you arrive in the country where you're flying to, and then you have an issue, right? Be it an issue at the custom or for any check or control, right? So what is the mindset that you should have versus this issue?
Yes, so this is actually a good point. Like, you can imagine that you arrive somewhere and then you need some document, for example, to enter the destination, and you realize you got the wrong document, or it's expired, or you're missing something. So I think people in this, and I think this was part of the reason why sometimes people didn't travel. It was a fear of something like this happening, because the rules were changing all the time. So they thought like, oh, this is going to happen to me for sure, and then they didn't want to go. So I think the mindset should be that you should think about this in advance, first of all, that if something like that would happen, what would I do? So what you should do is you should try to be calm first, of course, and then you should think constructively what you can do in that situation. So if, for example, you find out that you cannot enter that destination because you're missing some document because of restrictions, then you just talk to the people and say, oh, is there some way I could enter? Is there some exemption categories? Maybe you can quickly check on government website. And if not, you can ask them what your possibilities are. They might tell you, oh, maybe you can get a test and we do it over here. You might have to wait for the results. So that can be a possibility. Or if you have a test kit on you, or they sell it there, and they accept the what is it called, the rapid self-tests, or not self-tests, but they accept the rapid tests, then there are platforms where you can do that online. You can get the certificate, you do it in front of them on the camera, so that you can then do quickly at the airport. So there are possibilities. In some cases, you might have to rebook your flight, postpone your trip. You might have to stay an extra night or two somewhere. That might be inconvenient, cost some extra money, but it can solve the situation. So there's always things you can do. You just have to take a systematic approach.
Yeah. And I would say don't panic, right? Because what you should not do is as important as what you should be doing, right?
It can also be, like, there can also be alternative options. Let's say, you're trying to get from one country to another, and you booked a flight because it's most convenient for you. Then you found out that it's too difficult to fly. You cannot manage to get all the documents in place. And then you might reconsider, maybe you cross the border instead by trains or buses or something like that. Maybe it will take more time, be less comfortable, but you can still do it. And in some cases on these kind of trips, the borders, they either sometimes don't check, or it's even sometimes was written in the regulation that these regulations don't apply for some types of transfer. That was actually very interesting. I've seen a lot that if you took, for example, a long distance international train or bus, you had to have these certificates and regulation, but it was some regional cross-border one, then you didn't have to. So you could schedule a longer trip specifically with those kind of connections, and then you could avoid it if that's easier for you than getting the documents.
That's a good idea. Okay.
So the point is there's always some options. You just have to think about it.
Perfect. That was great. I think that is very informative for the people who are still partially in fear of traveling, but still would like to do it, right? So make use of Andrew's advice because they are valuable and they were. All right. Thanks for your time, Andrew. That was nice to have you today.
Thank you also.
Cheers.